Now, after months of telling people to work from home if they can, the government now wants people to go back to the office. But many workers don't want to, and some employers say their business are more efficient with staff at home. Ministers and business leaders are worried that some places could become ghost towns if staff don't go back to work. Well, join me now is Danielle Parsons, who's an employment lawyer at Slater and Gordon. We're also joined by the founder and CEO of Bishopsgate Financial, Mike Hampson. Also with us is Kate Vine from the design and architecture firm Perkins and Will. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us this evening. Mike, if I could firstly kick off with you. So you ditched working in the city because of the pandemic. How has that been for you? And perhaps most importantly for you, what's business productivity been like?
So we were looking to move offices just before the pandemic came in, and as a result of being locked down, we couldn't actually look for a new office. And once we got into lockdown, we realised we were working very effectively in a remote working environment and decided not to bother getting another office. So that's how it's come about. We were in many ways quite fortunate that we didn't have to give notice on the lease, which is what ties a lot of people in. But in terms of productivity, we found that it works very well. There's clearly things that you have to manage, making sure people have got the right setup, the right environment. But our employees, who we talk to regularly about how it's going, are very happy with how it's going and seeing lots of benefits, particularly in their pocket by not paying for commuting. So
in many ways, you were forced to do this, to close the city office down. But had there been conversations about it before the pandemic? Were you thinking about going in that direction? Were some of your colleagues talking about it?
We weren't actually, but what happened was the whole world moved to a different way of working overnight. And what wouldn't have been necessarily acceptable for a company like us just to say, right, we're working remotely, and our clients wouldn't necessarily like that. Everyone had to move to a different way of working, as I say, overnight, and it's become totally acceptable across the industry. And we talked to our clients. We did a quick survey of about 26 of the banks who we do our work for, and nearly all of those are seriously evaluating what their work footprint needs to look like and how they will shift to a more remote working environment. Not a complete remote working environment, but that people will work more remotely going forward.
Kate, given what Mike has just said, is the city destined to look very different in the coming years?
Absolutely. I think design and architecture and how the city buildings are used are going to change dramatically. The epidemic has obviously been a catalyst for change and how people use space.
So what is it likely to look like in the future?
We speculate that the city will look more like a community hub, bringing people together when and if they need to collaborate, be creative, create a culture and a community within their offices. I think traditional working at a desk or in a more corporate environment will change quite dramatically. People might work from home. There might be flexibility to come into the office, but it's really around giving people choice and the ability to use buildings as they see fit.
So, Danielle, there does seem to be a bit of a shift, but if what the government is saying is anything to go by, it still really wants people to go back to the workplace, go back to the office. Legally, where do businesses stand? Can they force people to go back to work?
Well, I'm an employment lawyer. I want people to be happy and to feel safe at work. And I think that that's really important. I absolutely don't want people to feel that they're being forced to return to a workplace when perhaps, for example, they're struggling with issues around childcare or other caring responsibilities. I think employees and employers, these are difficult issues. They're nuanced issues. And I think where an employer wants an employee to return to work, I think they should be informing them, consulting with them, discussing this with them, and making sure above all that it's actually safe and it's appropriate for them to return to work. And the infrastructure is in place to support them with that. I mean, we're still struggling with the situation where many don't have childcare, and it's not particularly clear what's going to happen in terms of schools reopening. So I think a lot of people are feeling very anxious about this.
Mike, where do you stand on this? I mean, do you think the government should be getting involved in telling people or telling employers to get their employees to go back to work, or should it be left to the businesses? I mean, they know their staff, they know the people that work for them. Should it be left to the employer and the employee, and should we have less government involvement in this?
Absolutely, Gamal. I think you've actually hit the nail on the head. there's a difference between returning to work and returning to the office. And the government is desperate to get people back to the office because they think that's going to help regenerate parts of the economy that are really struggling. But in terms of people working, they are working at the moment, and they're working very effectively from their remote or home environments. Each organisation is going to make a decision based on whether they need to go back to the office or how much they need to go back to the office. And that decision will be taken on commercial basis, what's right for their employees and what's right for their clients. So the government should really not be telling people you've got to go back to the office. It's a desperate sort of message that they're putting out because they're just trying to get parts of the economy going that they see as failing. Whereas actually there is more money going into people's pockets, and people will be spending that money in their local communities. They're not travelling in, they'll spend it in their local towns, those kinds of things.
And Kate, from an architect's point of view, we've been presented with an opportunity here. Yes, more people could well be working from home, but actually the result of that could be potentially more housing in this city, bringing house prices down. We're constantly talking about the desperate need for housing for younger people. A lot of people can't afford to live in cities, centres like London or Manchester or Leeds, wherever it may be. Is an opportunity being presented here?
I mean, I think it's a really exciting time for cities, not just in London, but globally. And really understanding how we can repurpose some of these existing buildings. And, also from a sustainable perspective, repurposing and kind of rejuvenating and reinvigorating the city is a fantastic opportunity and a fantastic narrative. It's a fantastic story to tell.
Mike?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. I think the government has got bigger agendas that they should be trying to address and take this as an opportunity to really address some of the bigger issues they like to talk about, but don't generally do much about. So housing, as Kate was just saying there, they could repurpose parts of the city and create quite vibrant young communities. One of the guys who works for us has been able to afford to move into his own place just south of the river. And that environment is really buzzing at night. So when you walk across the city into the office space environment in the city, that's when it's dead. And then I think there's also the climate change agenda. If hundreds of thousands of commuter journeys can be taken out of the daily work routine, that's got to play a very big role straight away in terms of addressing some of these climate targets we want to meet.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. Do stay with us, panel. We're just going to go to a short break and we'll be with you in just a few minutes. Do so with us on Sky News. Still to come, we'll continue with this panel discussion about whether it's right for people to be going back to work. Stay with us. Hello, welcome back. Our panel is still with us. Danielle, if I could start with you. I mean, there does seem to be a lot of upsides with working from home. But I guess one concern that many employees will have is that if you're working from Cheshire or one of the shires, then there's every reason to believe that in a few years' time, your job might be taken to Mumbai or Manila or somewhere else around the globe. Is there anything in the law that says that businesses can't do that?
Well, if you're an employee with 2 or more complete continuous years of service, then you will have unfair dismissal rights. So that will mean that your employer will need a fair reason at law for dismissing you, and it will need to carry out a fair process also. Now, if there's a workplace closure or there is a reduced need for the role and work that you're performing, then that can sometimes give rise to a redundancy situation. However, your employer will need to have that as a reasonable reason for dismissing you in the circumstances. And I think if at any point you are concerned with anything to do with job security, contact an employment solicitor and get legal advice ASAP, or contact your union.
Mike, perhaps a conversation that you're not privy to because they're your employees, but do you know, have you had any idea whether these kind of conversations are going on? Are people concerned about their futures? Because if they're working from home, in a few years' time, you might just say, well, look, you're too expensive. It's a lot cheaper to get somebody who works in Manila.
We are actually having a conversations like that, and I think there's several good reasons why people shouldn't be worried. I think the first thing is, and Danielle probably better qualified than I to talk about this, we've gone through a process of changing everyone's work terms and conditions of employment, so that their place of employment is now their home. Secondly, I think that in terms of access to a wider talent pool, as opposed to just tapping now into people who can commute into the City of London, we can actually access talent from across the country. So we're opening up a talent pool across the country. So I think levelling up the country is an opportunity here. You can also offer people much more flexible employment. So people who, an hour's commute each way would take a large chunk of their day out, so therefore going back to work may not be such a good option for them. You can easily then actually give them an option to work half-time or part-time from their own home. And I actually think that a combination of those things means that some jobs may start coming back onshore as opposed to there being a risk of them going offshore. Because the reasons jobs go offshore, it's the cost of the labour, and it's also the cost of the premises that people are sitting in the City of London. And if that goes away, all of a sudden that offshoring question becomes a lot more difficult, and therefore you're more likely to bring jobs back.
Yeah. Kate, we spoke about opportunities for housing. I wonder if there's potentially an opportunity for the high street. If people live local, they work local, they're more likely to go shopping local. So they might nip out over lunch to grab a sandwich from their local cafe. Could that potentially revitalise the high street? Is that something that, as an architect, you'd be thinking about, how to reinvent the high street?
Absolutely. And we're already having conversations with certain clients at the moment to look at ways of, as I said before, kind of repurposing buildings, repurposing premises. And one of the things that we've been talking about is, using some of those high street facilities and converting them into, ad hoc workspaces, places where people can come and collaborate, really trying to emphasize this idea of a kind of hub and spoke model where you've got a central office that serves a certain function and purpose in the center of London, but then also having a kind of spoke or an extension of that office in more regional locations where people don't have to commute as long to get to it, but also have the same facilities and the same support services for them to be able to do their jobs.
Yeah, and Danielle, I did ask Mike this earlier. I mean, as a lawyer, do you think the government should be getting involved in this conversation from a legal point of view, or should it be left down to the employer and the employee?
Well, I have been quite disappointed today to see some of the coverage that has been in the media around this topic, and some of it I think has been unhelpful. And I think it's certainly wrong for anyone to suggest that employees need to be seen to be in the office, to be performing, and that kind of thing. So I think that has been quite unhelpful to the debate. But I think actually a lot of what Mike and Kate has said has been quite helpful, particularly around diversity and looking at bigger talent pools and so on. And I think that the remote working can have huge challenges, but also huge opportunities as well. So I think that there's going to be a lot of positives that come out of this.
Mike, Danielle picked up on diversity there. I guess it's one thing if you're a 45-year-old man with 3 kids at home and you do want to spend a bit more time at home with your family and it's constructive, you're in an environment where you can do your work. But I guess if you've got an employee who's 22 years old, lives in a shared property with a load of friends, it's a very different experience, very difficult and different for that person to be able to work at home.
That's absolutely right. And again, that's where the employer, or, like ourselves, has got to have conversations with everybody who's working for them. We went to great lengths to make sure everyone had the right home setup. And if they didn't have the right home setup, we've given them access to business lounges where they can go and work in a better environment, getting them out of there. They can't be sitting on their bed in their pajamas on a laptop. That's just not good for health. It's not good for doing the job. So the employers have got to be responsible about how you do this. You can't just say, everyone go home, we'll save money on the offices. It's got to be done in a professional way. The right contracts have got to be in place. And you've got to make sure that everyone's got the right working environment and provide them with desks, chairs, computer equipment, whatever they need.
OK, Mike Thompson, Kate Vine and Danielle Parsons, many thanks indeed to the three of you for joining us this evening. A fascinating, interesting conversation. Thank you.